Hi everyone, welcome to Collapse Astrology and welcome back if you've caught one of my other videos. My name is Hummingbird and today we're going to get into RFK Jr.'s astrology. So for those of you who are new here, this is the fourth video in a series I'm creating on the US presidential election. And I already have chart reads up for Trump, for Kamala Harris, and for Joe Biden. And the final video in this series will get into the astrology of Election Day itself and my predictions for what might happen. And I'm choosing to include RFK Jr. for two main reasons. The first one I'll explain a little bit more about in just a minute, but I think that no matter what happens at the election, RFK Jr. is very relevant to the United States Pluto return. And also, his chart has really wild overlaps, not with the election day chart, but with the chart for the inauguration in January. So I do think that this election is very important for him, even though it's looking more and more like he has no chance of winning. I wouldn't be surprised if he does end up with a significant cabinet position or something else by the time Inauguration Day rolls around. So let's go ahead and get into it. I will bring up his natal chart. We'll start with a little summary of the natal chart. So there's no birth time available for RFK Jr. So this is just a chart that is cast for noon on the day he was born. And actually it is a potentially very aligned chart for him. The basics here are there is a massive Capricorn stellium, including Mercury, the Sun, Venus, the North Node, and Chiron, all in Capricorn. And then directly opposite all of that is Uranus conjunct the South Node in Cancer. All of this opposition is directly squared by Neptune and Lilith in Libra. He's got a Cancer moon, always an interesting placement in a man in particular. His Mars is in Scorpio, along with Saturn also in Scorpio. And I thought this placement was interesting too. Pluto in Leo exactly conjunct the asteroid Juno. So since there's no birth time for RFK, when I looked him up, I just cast his chart for 12 p.m. And when this chart came up, I was like, dang, like this could really work for him. So this birth time, first of all, it places the South Node and Uranus right on the IC, right on the bottommost point of the chart. And this area of the chart is related to ancestry. It's related to your blood lineage. So obviously, Bobby Kennedy's blood ancestry is a really important part of who he is. And I would expect to see something on the bottom of the chart. I would expect to see some kind of placement there indicating how important that is. So it wouldn't have to be the South Node, but it would make sense too that there could be a direct overlap between his soul karma, which is what the South Node is related to, and then him being born into such a prolific elite lineage. The noon birth time gives him a Taurus rising. I did play around with this a little bit, didn't do any official like rectification techniques or anything, but just kind of playing around. I found charts with both a Libra and a Scorpio rising that basically reverse this chart, and they put the Capricorn stellium at the bottom of the chart, South Node and Uranus at the top. I think that also could make sense. And, you know, from the little that I've observed of RFK Jr., I could see any of those rising signs, Taurus or Libra or Scorpio, applying to him. So I'm just going to leave the chart, you know, laid out like this, and mostly I won't reference the house placements too much. Especially with the Capricorn stellium, though, there are a lot of overlapping themes between Capricorn and the 10th house. So a lot of what I'll say about this especially really applies whether or not this noon birth time is accurate. And with this stellium also, there are just so many placements here, so there are going to be a lot of layers to it, which I will be trying to peel back. So I would say the most obvious association between Capricorn and RFK Jr. is the family background that he comes from. Capricorn is the sign of the elite. It's the sign of tradition and hierarchy. It's the sign of the ruling class and of big business. It's the sign of government. It's the sign of structural power, of big institutions. It's also a very ambitious sign. And Bobby Kennedy, no matter where all this Capricorn is actually operating in his chart, he's got a lot. He's got a lot of all those things that I just named. He's been very career focused in his life. He's been focused on making his own impact, creating a legacy beyond just being a member of a famous family. And that really describes heavy Capricorn. It's likely to be career focused. It's likely to be ambitious, no matter where it is in the chart. Now, Capricorn is not a revolutionary sign. It really likes stability, order, predictability, and control, but it also does like progress, and it is not the type to wait around for someone else to solve a problem. It's a cardinal sign, which means it's very initiatory, and it usually doesn't feel satisfied unless it's seeing some kind of result, some kind of progress, some kind of ROI that is trackable and tangible. So I imagine with all this Capricorn that Kennedy is probably a really hard worker. I also do get the feeling that he may be antisocial. He may have trouble forming vulnerable, deep emotional connections. His Cancer moon definitely wants that, but there's a harshness, a callousness that could show up with all of this Capricorn. And I feel like that also could be related to some kind of neurodivergence, which I'll say a little bit more about in just a minute. Before we really dive in, I want to give a little context, though, to my thoughts around Kennedy and, disclose my bias, if you will. So first of all, as I said, I think that RFK Jr. has some very important role to play in the complex karmic story that is the United States Pluto return. I talked a little bit about this in my Biden video, and you can find a much deeper breakdown of the US Pluto return on my Medium page. But basically, the Pluto return speaks to the upheaval and breakdowns happening in the United States right now and our need as Americans to reckon with the bloody history of this country. I do think karmically it goes back even further than 1776. I think it goes back at least to ancient Rome. And this is also something I've mentioned once or twice. It's a very undeveloped theory, just an intuitive nudge that has been coming through for a few years now. And you'll probably hear me fleshing that out as I keep making videos here. So I think that RFK Jr. has some connection to that ancient karma that is resurfacing now. Also, if you know anything about the underbelly of American history, you know the whole Kennedy lineage is very relevant to what has been hidden from most Americans in the more modern construction of our national mythos. So I won't get into the really ancient stuff in this video, but definitely you can't talk about RFK Jr. without talking about the Kennedy family legacy. I would say that I'm a mid-grade nerd around the Kennedy unalivings of the 1960s. I'm not someone who can give you the details of every important character involved or every bullet angle, but I know a decent amount about the historical circumstances of the time and the direction the Kennedys wanted to take post-World War II America versus what more right-wing factions in the government wanted. And I know enough about the inconsistencies in the stories of both unalivings that I am completely convinced that both of them were intelligence conspiracies. And RFK Jr. knows this too. I don't know his whole political education or exactly what he believes, but I know that he knows that it wasn't two lone nuts who killed his father and uncle. I also know he's friendly with and sometimes sponsors the prominent researchers into the Kennedy conspiracies, like Oliver Stone, David Talbot, and Lisa Pease. So RFK Jr. was 9 years old when his uncle John F. Kennedy died, and he was 14 when his father, Robert F. Kennedy, died. He doesn't explicitly talk about the subject of the unalivings that often, but in the interviews I watched with him, he does like to bring up his childhood or family. And of course, interviewers are going to be interested in that. But when he talks about his family, he really establishes his insider nature. And when he says things that are contrary to the mainstream narrative around government, there's a felt sense of authority behind it, a felt sense of that insider viewpoint. At least that's what I feel, and I think that is what he wants people to feel. And in particular, I think that that is appealing to men who mistrust the government for good reasons, but still want to believe in America. So ultimately, even if he is playing up his insider narrative on purpose, it's still a real thing. And he has a clarity about the corruption of the American political establishment that honestly is refreshing in contrast to the party babble of most politicians. So anyway, my bias is that I have had a bad feeling about RFK Jr. since I first saw his content, which was back in 2020. And that bad feeling has not really gone away. But that doesn't mean that I'm in complete opposition to him or his ideas. I do think because of this square between Mercury and Neptune, that he's a liar, probably a talented liar. But he's got some things right, things that I've uncovered on my own path of DS research that are still very denied and under-discussed in the mainstream. He's got some accurate takes on China and US foreign policy, although unfortunately he is completely compromised by the fake country, which takes the integrity out of any other foreign policy positions he might pretend to have. But he really does talk about geopolitics in a way that most establishment politicians never would. And on the subject of shots, I'll just say that I am personally very undecided. I think it's a very complex issue, but I definitely think that there have always been a lot of grifters on that scene and that RFK Jr. is one of them. He's really an OG grifter on that scene. And, also that doesn't mean that everything he said on the subject was wrong or a lie. So I'll just say I do not trust him, but that doesn't mean I disagree with him on everything by any means. Okay, so now let's get into it a little bit more. Let's talk a little bit about his childhood. So we can first see there's this Cancer moon, 10 degrees of Cancer. It's in a square to the asteroid Ceres over here in Libra. And Bobby was the third of 11 children. I heard an interview where he said that he had a beautiful childhood with 29 cousins, and that would make sense if his moon was in the third house, which is related to cousins and extended family. A third house Cancer moon with lots of cousins is probably going to be pretty happy as a kid if there aren't any negative aspects to the moon, which there aren't, except for this square to Ceres does look like something kind of challenging. But I would guess overall he felt pretty loved and taken care of. His father, Robert F. Kennedy Sr., was known to have had multiple affairs, and his mother, Ethel Kennedy, never remarried after his father died. So that sort of like misplaced loyalty makes me think of Ceres and Libra, since Ceres is related to the archetypal mother wound. Libra is related to marriage and partnerships. And also, RFK Jr.'s relationship with his mother did become strained right after his father died because he became a heroin addict at age 15 and was addicted until he got sober at age 29 at his Saturn return and when Pluto was squaring his nodes. So right before that, in September 1983, when Saturn was transiting his Neptune, he got caught trying to bring heroin on an airplane and was arrested. So this Neptune that squares his nodes definitely looks like a particular tendency towards addiction that's very explicit in his chart, a very significant and lifelong karmic struggle. I think it's taken other forms in his later life, but this early substance addiction was his first encounter with this karmic struggle. And Lilith, who's a tight part of the conjunction and the T-square, in this case makes me think of the succubus, the way that some addicts relate to their drug as a she. I think heroin in particular is related to that way and, kind of imagined as a tempting seductress who beckons addicts towards the high. And the way that RFK Jr. tells it, he was able to get sober after his arrest by reading the work on addiction of Carl Jung and of Bill Wilson, the founder of AA. RFK Jr. was a really high-functioning addict, so he was in his 20s for most of his addiction. He was trying to climb the ladder in his career, and as a Capricorn, he really did not like being addicted. He knew that it was holding him back. In an interview, he said that he had an iron will everywhere else in his life, which is a very Capricorn quality, but he couldn't control the addiction. And so that is just such a precise description of a Neptune square to all of this Capricorn energy. So now he's 40 years sober, although I think there have been other incarnations of this Neptune square, including sex addiction and maybe now the wellness health bro stuff that he's into, possibly also Libra style networking and influence courting, clout chasing, that kind of thing. But just to zero in on the personal planets for a minute here. So the Sun, Mercury, and Venus are all in a stellium in late Capricorn. And again, I feel drawn to use the phrase antisocial to describe this energy. Obviously, it's not going to be that way in everyone who has a strong Capricorn presence. It's just one possibility of it. But such concentrated, intense energy, this is why I think that it could look like some type of neurodivergence, the way that autistic people sometimes experience themselves as having trouble reading social or emotional cues from others or feeling empathy. Strong Capricorn can be harsh, cold, callous, shut down. I think for Bobby, growing up with such immense privilege and entitlement that comes with being born into such a legacy and such wealth, it would not be surprising if this Capricorn developed into that kind of harsh, insensitive manifestation of itself. And I'll also just say, this is kind of a sidebar, but I think a heavy concentration of any sign could probably manifest as one or another compilation of what we might call neurodivergent symptoms. This is another underdeveloped theory of mine, actually, but I think astrology can help us understand neurodivergence and brain chemistry in less rigid terms, and terms that don't divide our polymorphous humanity into normal and non-normal categories. That also does not mean there's anything determinative, though, about strong Capricorn becoming a malevolent form of antisocial, for example. That's going to come about partly through circumstance and partly through choice as a person develops themselves over the course of their life. So let's zero in on Mercury for a minute here at 28 degrees of Capricorn, and let's talk about RFK Jr.'s voice. If you've ever heard him talk, you know that his voice sounds extremely rough and gravelly, like how someone with a tracheotomy sounds. But RFK Jr. actually has a rare neurological disorder called spasmodic dysphonia that causes the muscles inside his larynx to shake when he speaks, which is what causes that strained, shaky sound. And it's an extremely rare disorder. It sometimes has a trackable cause, but often does not. And as far as I can tell, Bobby does not know the origin of his. He said in an interview that it started to come on when he was around age 42, which would have been in 1996. And I checked the transits on this, and between 1994 and 1997, Uranus and then Neptune transited all of these late Capricorn planets, with Mercury last. When Neptune was on his Mercury, it was also squaring his natal Neptune. And there's a quote when he's talking about the spasmodic dysphonia. He said when that came on, his voice was his whole job, which I think is just another point for this birth time in a 10th house Mercury. But this happened at a time when he was already in environmental law, but was really starting to cultivate a celebrity persona, speaking at conferences, that kind of thing. So it's really pretty impressive, honestly, for him to have overcome that, for him to have kept moving forward so publicly after such an extremely rare setback. But I guess if any sign has that steely determination to move through whatever challenge shows up, it would be Capricorn. And obviously not everyone who has Neptune transiting their Mercury develops spasmodic dysphonia. So for him, this is definitely something karmic. It relates to the nodes. It's something very unique to whatever specific soul lesson he is here to learn in this life. And Neptune really does describe the mysteriousness of it all, the slow process of it coming on, his lack of control over any of it. All of that is very Neptunian. His Venus in Capricorn is also very interesting. Venus is exactly conjunct the North Node here, which means that Venusian themes like emotions, love, surrender, femininity, all of these are unfamiliar soul territory for him. So there's an energy here that could be very brittle, controlled, controlling. Again, it makes me wonder about his close interpersonal relationships. If this 10th house placement is right, it would make sense that he would have a lot of professional relationships where boundaries are kind of different, where emotional vulnerability is less of a thing. And those kind of relationships might work better for him than closer, more vulnerable interpersonal relationships. His Cancer moon, of course, it does crave emotional connection. But I feel like all the Capricorn energy could be a very hard shell around the Cancer moon. And honestly, deep in his soft center here, he might also be a super victimized little baby boy at his core, even if he doesn't show that in his outer layers. So RFK Jr.'s first Saturn return was when he got sober. And his second Saturn return was almost to the day of when his second wife, Mary Richardson, took her own life in May 2012. That's another point for this birth time, since it puts Saturn right on the descendant. And at the same time as that transit was happening, Pluto was in mid-Capricorn opposing RFK Jr.'s moon. So I think that corresponds to what happened almost immediately after Mary took her own life, is that her diaries were discovered, and inside of them were a lot of stories about RFK Jr.'s cheating and how miserable he made her. So Pluto opposite the moon, lots of private information being exposed during that time. I don't know much about his current wife, Cheryl Hines. If anyone has insight into their relationship, I'd love to hear about it. So another thing that makes sense about this birth time is that it places Libra in the 6th house. If Neptune and Lilith in this square to the nodes represent a big karmic challenge that is this proclivity towards addiction, which Neptune does traditionally represent, it really aligns with the 6th house in multiple different forms. So there was the heroin addiction in his youth. And like I said, he was a high functioning addict. He was working hard on his career. He was putting in the daily grind, which is a 6th house thing, even as he was doing heroin regularly. Then there was sex addiction, which makes a lot of sense with Lilith being here. And it was happening during his marriage, which is also Libra related. The daily life aspect of marriage is a 6th house thing. And these days, I speculate this may be playing out as his obsession with health and fitness. Those kind of routines, those kind of self-care practices are a 6th house thing. The Libra energy can present as vanity. And then B, also the way that these days he has very clearly put a lot of effort into building networks of influence, the way that he podcast hops, the way that he makes his daily life and his work about his relationships, that also applies in the 6th house. Saturn here in Scorpio is the ruler of his North Node. His Mars is also in Scorpio. And I think these are the planets, maybe along with Capricorn, but these are the planets that draw him to the darker, kind of edgier side of things. They give him his strategy. They give him his psychological awareness and intuition, which I do think is sharp. They could be energies that make him subconsciously paranoid. He could be a sadist, which can be a shadow Capricorn manifestation as well. There have been allegations of him assaulting a family babysitter when he was in his 40s. The babysitter was in her early 20s. And I have my suspicions about him being into some dark occult practices these days, based on some of the people that he's connected to. And RFK Jr. has actually said explicitly in response to the allegations about the babysitter, he said he has, quote, "so many skeletons in my closet that if they could all vote, I could run for king of the world." Okay. Then he has Pluto in Leo, exactly conjunct the asteroid Juno. This third decan of Leo is associated with the divine right of kings, and for whatever reason, it's super common in the charts of the American political elite. And Pluto in Leo in particular represents a generation, the narcissist boomer generation that is refusing to pass the reins of power, not just in government, but really all over our society. RFK Jr. is 70 years old, so I'm not saying he's not competent, but he's definitely part of that generation, needing to center himself in history, trying to make a big move in his own career at this point in his life. And then you have Juno, which brings in themes of marriage, partnerships, fidelity and infidelity, jealousy, complex attachment dynamics. And this just makes me think of how both Bobby's father and uncle were notorious playboys and cheaters, and it just seems like something that he directly inherited. And so now let's just take a real quick look at his transits. Like I said, Bobby's chart has some wild overlaps with the chart for the presidential inauguration ceremony on January 20th, 2025. So I'll be getting into those in the next video, but a few other interesting pieces here. The main one, honestly, is that Pluto here is at 0 degrees of Aquarius, and that means that Pluto recently transited this entire Capricorn stellium. Between about 2017 and 2023 were the most aligned dates. So that also lines up with the US Pluto return, and the whole Capricorn stellium is at the same degree as the United States Pluto. That's at 27 degrees of Capricorn. But obviously, this was also during the pandemic when Bobby made a much bigger name for himself than ever with his takes on vaccines and on general government corruption. And I think some kind of radicalization happened during that time, maybe even a red pilling of sorts. I also used the word radicalization to describe what I think happened to Kamala Harris in her 20s when Pluto was transiting her Sun and Mercury. And this is something similar. It's like a radicalization towards power, towards the establishment. So, I mean, Bobby Kennedy was very much already like aligned with that elite demographic and that power class. But what happened when Pluto transited this Capricorn energy, I think it was an even deeper kind of conversion towards the kind of highest and maybe deepest and darkest echelons of power. There was a quote that I could not find when I searched for it. I think he said it in about 2020 or 2021. And I don't know, maybe he said things like this a lot of times. But I just remember one thing that he said at a rally somewhere or, some kind of event, very apocalyptic, something along the lines of, we are in a spiritual battle, a great reckoning is coming between good and evil, that kind of thing. And this is the occult spirituality, that ayahuasca fascism, if you will. I think that RFK Jr. has his own apocalyptic messiah complex. I think that is why he's running for president. Maybe he thinks that he's supposed to complete his family's legacy by leading the country into some kind of rebirth. Maybe he actually thinks that he can save America. But I do not trust him. Like I said, I don't even trust him to be genuinely aligned with anyone other than the darkest of deep political actors. He was on JE's airplane twice, which could explain why he is so compromised by the fake country. his active support for the fake country undermines and contradicts everything else he says about American foreign policy. And I think that he knows it's a popular position to say that he'd rein in the military and stop the forever wars. But I think that's not what he actually intends. And I think that the neocons, the DS actors, know that. I think that he speaks another language under his breath. And this Mercury square Neptune, it's notoriously an alignment that can lie. It makes for a good liar. And if a person with this alignment wants to hold themselves to a high standard of honesty, they'll have to be very mindful of their words. They'll have to be very, very intentional about their expression in order to channel this Neptune energy cleanly and with integrity. If you have an alignment like this, one way to manage it is to write fiction or to find some other outlet like that that allows you to just let your imagination explore without worrying about the line between fantasy and reality. And especially with RFK's chart with Neptune in Libra, there's an aura of niceness around what he said. It sounds good and right and even righteous. You know, you want to believe him. I feel that way when I'm listening to him talk about government corruption. But if you just follow him uncritically, first of all, the man can talk. Like if you check out some of the interviews that are linked below, it's like he can go on for 30 minutes. The interviewer like hasn't said a word. And he's real good at the, you might call it word salad. The interviews that I've listened to with RFK Jr., even when he's talking for 30 minutes straight, I would not call that word salad. Word salad is definitely a real thing where a lot of people say things that just don't make any sense, but they sound good. They almost kind of like reel you in with their hypnotic, nice sounding speeches. And yeah, that's not RFK Jr., in my opinion. But if you follow him uncritically, when he's talking, you miss when he jumps from saying logical things to, for example, totally racist things, like when he said that COVID-19 was targeted to attack Caucasian and Black people while Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese were the most immune. So you have to kind of keep your mind sharp. And then also if you listen to RFK Jr. speak in different settings, he's very aware of, what he plays up, what he doesn't play up, depending when he's on a more mainstream outlet or publication versus when he's on something that, is going to be attracting people who crave more edgy viewpoints. A final interesting piece in his transits is that it is his Jupiter return right at this moment. And that means he's going through an expansive period, a period of maturation, maybe also an overwhelming period. I think this is kind of a funny alignment in light of recent reports that he asked both Harris and Trump for positions in their administrations in exchange for dropping out. But RFK denied the charge that he approached Kamala Harris's team. And honestly, I kind of believe him. While it sounds like Trump actually wanted him to drop out, but RFK said no. So I'm not sure how to interpret all that, but there are some funny Gemini vibes there. Multiple versions of stories and facts and intentions floating around. Since he got kicked off the ballot in New York, it seems like his chances of even making a dent in the race are going down even further. But if RFK Jr. does drop out, I am sure it won't be the last we'll see of him. Because of the inauguration chart, like I said, I would definitely not be surprised to see him end up with some kind of important government appointment, no matter who actually wins the presidency. And who knows, maybe somehow he'll even end up winning in the end. All right, so we'll finish here for now. I would love to hear what you think of RFK Jr. What do you think his real intention is of running for president? Let me know in the comments. And if you liked this video, please hit like, hit subscribe so that you don't miss the grand finale of this series, as well as all kinds of other astropolitical content I've got planned for the fall. I will see you next time.